The gray came first, before the sun did anything about it. It slid in over the garage roof like water finding the low places, pooling in the cracks of the parking lot, softening the chain-link fence into something almost gentle. He stood at the foot of the stairwell with a cup of coffee he had not yet drunk, steam going nowhere in the still air, and watched her. She was on the third step, barefoot, the toddler heavy and loose-limbed against her chest, in the particular way of children who have decided, finally, that the world can be trusted enough to sleep in. The mother's hand moved without her seeming to notice it moved, fingers curling up and over the small mouth, not pressing, just resting, a cup around a flame, a gesture built for silence, a gesture that had once meant survival and now meant nothing more than a lullaby, than, "Hush now, hush," than a habit worn smooth by 14 months of not needing it. He had seen that hand do that before. He had seen it on a night so hot the asphalt at the rest stop had gone soft underfoot, when the same gesture had meant something entirely different, had meant, "If she makes a sound, he will find us." The coffee had gone cold in his hand, and he had not noticed. He was 61 years old, built like something left out in weather too long, gray in the beard and gray in the eyes, a man who had buried a daughter 14 years ago and had not said her name aloud since. The vest he wore had a rattle in the inside pocket, small and silver, shaped like a crescent moon, and some mornings he forgot it was there until his hand found it without asking permission. This morning his hand found it. Below him, the mother shifted her weight, and the child made a small sound, not distress, just sleep talking through a dream, and the hand tightened for half a second, an old reflex surfacing and receding like a fish turning under still water, and then she saw him watching, and she did not look away, and neither did he. 14 months ago she had not known his name. 14 months ago she had been standing in a rest stop parking lot outside a town called Willow Creek, with her own hand cupped exactly that way, over a 7-month-old's mouth, in 102-degree heat, asking 6 strangers on motorcycles to help her make her daughter quiet enough not to be found. He set the coffee down on the step railing. There is a night that explains a morning like this one, and it starts on Route 9, at the tail end of August, with the heat still rising off the blacktop after dark like the day refused to let go of what it had taken all afternoon to build. It starts with 6 engines ticking as they cooled, and a woman running toward the sound of them instead of away, which should have told him everything before she said a single word. The rest stop sat off Route 9 like something the desert had forgotten to finish building. A single sodium light buzzing over cracked pavement, a vending machine with its glass gone milky from years of sun, a concrete picnic table nobody used after May. He remembered the smell most, hot asphalt and diesel and the mineral tang of dust kicked up by wind that never quite arrived. 6 bikes stood in a loose crescent near the pumps, chrome throwing back what little light there was, engines still ticking as the metal contracted, a sound like a clock running down. He had pulled a rag over his knuckles, working grease from a chain he hadn't needed to check, because his hands liked work even when his mind didn't. That was when the car came in too fast. A sedan, sun-faded blue, one headlight dimmer than the other, tires chirping once against the concrete lip of the entrance before it swung hard into the lot and stopped crooked across 2 spaces, as though the driver had stopped steering and only remembered to brake. The engine kept running a moment after the car went still, the way a held breath lingers past the point of needing air. The door opened before the dust settled. She came out already moving, one arm hooked under an infant whose cry cut through the flat night air, high, insistent, unaware of anything but its own hunger or fear, and the other hand rising fast to press against the small mouth, not rough, but urgent in a way that made something in his chest go still before his mind caught up to why. She looked back at the road twice before she looked at them. Not at the pumps, not at the light, at them, 6 men in leather and dust and gray beards, men built for looking dangerous to anyone who hadn't learned yet what dangerous actually cost, and she walked toward them instead of the doors, instead of the phone booth with its handset hanging by a cord, instead of anywhere a woman running from something is supposed to run. He set the rag down. The wind, what there was of it, moved a strand of hair across her face, and she didn't push it back. Her knuckles were pale around the child. Her sandals were the kind meant for a driveway, not a highway shoulder, and the sole had begun to separate on one side, flapping faintly with each step, like something trying to speak. "Please," she said, close enough now that he could see the sweat at her hairline, the tremor in her jaw that wasn't the heat. "Please, I need her quiet. Just for a minute, just until he passes." Behind her, far down Route 9, headlights swept the horizon once, then steadied, then began, slowly, to grow larger. 14 months later, he still wakes before the alarm. It is a habit the war gave him, and the road never took away. That half-second of stillness before the body moves, when a man takes inventory of what's changed overnight and what hasn't. The garage apartment stairwell creaks the same way it did yesterday. The coffee maker in the clubhouse kitchen ticks the same way, and his hand, without asking permission from the rest of him, goes to the left pocket of the vest hanging on the chair. The rattle is always there. It has always been there, 14 years running, through 3 bikes and 2 clubs, and 1 war he came home from lighter than he left. Crescent moon-shaped, silver gone the color of old nickel, the handle worn smooth in the exact place a thumb rests without meaning to. He does not shake it. He has not shaken it since the night he put it in that pocket. He only holds it the way another man might hold a coin he carries for luck, except there is no luck in it, only the specific weight of a life that lasted 11 weeks and 4 days and left this behind on a nightstand nobody had emptied yet. Her name is not something he says out loud, not even now. Some griefs are load-bearing. You don't test them by leaning too hard. What he remembers instead is smaller and stranger. The hospital's fluorescent hum, his wife's hand gripping his so hard the knuckles went bloodless, and the nurse, kind, tired, unable to fix what needed fixing, pressing the rattle into his palm afterward, because someone had to take it, and it couldn't be her mother. Not yet. Not for months. He'd bought it as a pair without thinking, the way you buy things in twos when you don't yet know how fragile the number 1 really is. The twins sat in a drawer somewhere, in a house he no longer owned. This one had ridden in his pocket through 2 states' worth of grief before he stopped counting the states. He does not believe in signs. He has told younger riders as much, flatly, when they get poetic about omens on the road. But he has also learned, in 14 years, that a man's hands remember what his mouth refuses to. Downstairs, faintly, he can hear her moving, the young mother, the one who lives now above the garage with a child who no longer needs muffling, whose crying these days is the ordinary, unremarkable crying of a toddler who wants breakfast and not silence. He listens to it the way another man might listen to rain, proof of something still working. He closes his hand around the rattle once, the old motion, and lets it go. Outside, the morning is already warm, though nothing like that August. Nothing has ever been quite like that August. That August, the heat had not broken by 10 at night, which was the first thing he remembered about it, how the asphalt still gave off warmth through his boots, how the rest stop's single sodium light hummed above the pumps like it, too, was tired of the season. 6 bikes stood in a loose row, tanks open, the smell of gasoline and hot rubber thick enough to taste. He was checking his mirror bolts, an old habit, when he heard her before he saw her. Not footsteps, but breath. Short, controlled. The breath of someone trying not to be heard breathing. She came around the pump island with the baby against her chest, one hand splayed flat over the infant's back, the other cupped, already cupped, before he understood why, near the small face. She stopped an arm's length from him, close enough that he could see her knuckles were pale from gripping, and did not come closer than that, as if she had measured the distance 100 times in her head before deciding 6 feet was safe. "Please," she said, barely a word at all. More the shape of one. He straightened, slow, the way he'd learned to move around anything skittish, dogs, drunks, grief. "Ma'am, can you—" She glanced past him, toward the dark end of the lot, where the tree line swallowed the light, then back. "Can you help me keep her quiet? Just for a minute, please." He didn't ask why yet. That came later, in pieces, the way truth comes from people who have learned that the whole of it is dangerous to say out loud all at once. What he noticed first was the car, a gray sedan, unremarkable, parked at the far pump with its lights off, engine ticking as it cooled, though no one stood beside it. What he noticed second was that she had not blinked in the time it took her to speak. "There's a car," she said. "It's been circling. An hour, maybe more. I keep driving past exits so it won't know which one I'll take." Behind her, faintly, the infant stirred, made a sound that was not yet crying but was thinking about it, and her hand moved before the sound finished. Cupped, gentle, absolute, the exact motion of someone who has done this so many times that muscle has replaced thought. He looked at the other 5, scattered around their bikes, all of them gone still, in the particular way men go still when they've noticed the same thing at once. Nobody spoke. "Okay," he said, and it came out steadier than he felt. "Okay, come stand with us a minute." She did not move right away. She looked at him the way people look at a locked door they don't yet trust has opened. The nurse's truck still announced itself the same way it had 14 months ago, a low diesel rattle that carried up through the garage stairwell before her boots ever touched gravel. He heard it now, this gray October afternoon, and set down the wrench he'd been turning over more than using, and went out to meet her the way he always did, though she never asked him to. She was 71, and moved like someone who had spent 40 years learning which corners of a room held danger, and which didn't. Retired ICU, then retired hospice, then not retired at all, just quieter about the work. She carried a canvas bag with a blood pressure cuff in it, and a thermos of something herbal that smelled like a forest floor, and she climbed the stairs to the apartment without being told which ones creaked. He stood at the bottom and watched her go, the way he always did, and let himself remember, not fully, just enough, the particular shade of that first night, the one where everything could have gone the other direction. She'd taken the mother and the infant in at 2 in the morning, no questions past the ones that mattered, blood pressure and hydration, and a look in the eyes that told her more than any chart could. He remembered standing in her doorway that night with his hands still shaking faintly from 4 hours on back roads, watching her check the baby's fever with the back of her knuckles, an old-fashioned gesture, and thinking, this is the only reason any of this worked, not the bikes. Not the 6 of them fanned across 2 lanes like a slow-moving wall. Her, the place to arrive at. If she hadn't answered her phone at 2 a.m., if she'd been at her sister's in Ohio like she sometimes was, if the mother's fever had spiked an hour earlier, on some stretch of Route 9 with no exit for 11 miles. He didn't finish these thoughts anymore. He'd learned, over 14 months, to let them surface and pass instead of gripping them. Upstairs, he could hear the 2 of them talking, the nurse's voice low and even, the mother's rising slightly, something almost like a laugh. The toddler shrieked with the particular joy of being swung too high. He went back to the wrench, back to the bike that didn't need fixing, and understood that the nurse's visits weren't routine to him even if they were on her calendar. Each one was a small proof of survival, hers, the mother's, his own. He thought sometimes that he kept the garage cluttered on purpose, kept his hands busy, so that when the truck rattled up the drive he'd have something to set down. The screen door opened above him. The nurse came down first, folding her stethoscope into the bag. "She's healthy," she said. "Both of them." He nodded, the way he always did, as if he hadn't been holding his breath a little since the truck turned in. The nurse's truck pulled out the way it always did, slow over the gravel, lights sweeping once across the garage door before it straightened onto the road. He stood in the bay a moment longer than he needed to, listening to the quiet settle back into the building the way water settles after something's been dropped in it. 14 months back further than that, in a different kind of quiet, he had stood across from her in the sodium orange wash of the rest stop lights and done what he always did before anything else. He'd looked. She had no mark on her that he could see. No split lip, no yellowed eye, nothing a stranger could point to and call proof. But he'd spent 3 decades reading men who came back from places that didn't let them come back whole, and a body kept its own record whether or not the skin agreed to testify. She stood angled toward her car door, not away from it, like someone who'd trained herself always to have a way back into the driver's seat. When a truck's high beam swept the lot, She didn't flinch, the way a tired mother flinches at noise. She flinched the way a soldier flinches at a sound that used to mean something was about to happen. She'd counted the exits. He'd watched her do it, her eyes ticking to the 2 lit signs at either end of the lot, then to the gap in the tree line where a service road cut south, filing each one the way a person files exits in a building they don't trust to stay standing. "You always count your ways out?" he asked her. It wasn't the question he meant to ask first. It surprised him coming out of his own mouth, low, almost gentle, nothing like the voice he used with the crew. She looked at him properly then, for the first time since she'd come jogging up out of the dark with the baby's face pressed into her shoulder. "Habit," she said. "Bad one to need." She didn't answer that. Her hand moved instinctively to the back of the baby's head, fingers spread wide the way a person shields a candle from wind, and he understood the gesture wasn't about comfort. It was about muffling. "Who's circling the lot?" he asked. The question landed harder than he meant it to. Her whole body went still, not frozen exactly, but gathered, like an animal deciding whether the sound in the brush was wind or something worse. Behind her, out past the pumps, a set of headlights swept the tree line for the 3rd time in 20 minutes, slow, unhurried, the particular patience of someone who wasn't lost. She didn't look at the lights, she looked at him instead, and for a moment he thought she wasn't going to answer at all. "My husband," she said finally. "He's a police officer." The words came out of her like something being extracted rather than spoken, each one costing more than the last. He didn't press. He'd learned that much in 30 years of watching people decide whether to trust him. Pressing only sealed the door tighter. "There's a restraining order," she said, "signed in April. He's violated it twice already, and nothing happened either time." Her thumb moved against the baby's skull, slow circles, an old habit worn smooth. First time he said he was just driving through. Second time he said the same road doesn't belong to me. Behind her, the headlights swept the tree line again, patient, unbothered by darkness or hour, the sweep of something that had nowhere else to be. "How'd he find you tonight?" he asked. Not a real question. He already knew the shape of the answer before she gave it, the way you know a storm is coming from the color the sky turns an hour before the rain. "He's a deputy in the county I left. He has access to plate lookups, toll records." She said it flatly, reciting facts she'd clearly repeated to herself at 2 in the morning, more times than she could count, trying to make them smaller by naming them. "I don't understand how the system works. I just know he does. He found me in Denton in June. He found me outside Carbondale 3 weeks ago. I switched cars once, and it didn't matter." The baby stirred against her shoulder, a small, complaining sound quickly folded back into silence by the press of her palm, and he watched that motion again, the same gathering stillness, the same practiced quiet, and something in his chest turned over slow and cold, like a stone shifting at the bottom of a creek bed. "You call anyone? Sheriff? Hotline? Anybody?" "He is the sheriff's friend." She said it the way you'd state a fact about weather, immovable, already lived in. "I called a hotline in May. They gave me a number for a shelter, 2 counties over. It was full." He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say to that. Out past the pumps, the sedan's headlights swung wide one more time, unhurried, confident. The confidence of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry, because the world had always eventually caught up to wherever he stood and agreed with him. "You know what car you're driving now?" She looked at him, and for the first time he saw, not fear exactly, but exhaustion, so deep it had started to resemble calm, the flatline stillness of someone who had run out of the specific kind of energy that panic requires. "He's known for an hour," she said. "That's why I came to you." 14 months later, the folder was still in the same drawer. The former MP kept it in the bottom of a filing cabinet in the clubhouse office, beneath a stack of parts invoices and a coffee tin full of expired zip ties, as if the weight of ordinary things could keep it from meaning what it meant. He pulled it out on a Tuesday afternoon, when the garage was quiet, the toddler upstairs asleep to the sound of a box fan, and set it on the workbench between them, without ceremony, the way he'd once set down a rifle he'd finished cleaning. "You ever look at this again?" the protagonist asked. "Every few months," the quiet one said. "Make sure I still believe it." Inside were photographs, curling slightly at the corners, a plate number circled in red grease pencil, timestamps stamped in the corner of each frame like a second, smaller confession. There were transcript pages from the IA hearing, sentences highlighted in yellow that had long since faded to the color of weak tea. Dates. A printout of a DMV query log with the husband's badge number listed 11 times in 4 months, only 2 of which corresponded to any open case file. 11, the protagonist said. 11 that we found. The former MP said it flatly, the way he said most things, like a man reading a gauge rather than offering an opinion. My contact thinks there's more further back. System didn't log everything before a policy change in 19. He could have been running plates on her for years before that road ever got as far as us. The protagonist turned one photograph toward the window light, the sedan, blurred at the edges from a phone held low against a dashboard, the man's silhouette barely visible behind the glass. Patient, unbothered, a man checking his mirrors on a street he believed already belonged to him. You ever wonder how many others, the protagonist said. It wasn't really a question. I try not to. The former MP closed the folder, but didn't put it away yet. I try to just be glad we caught the one. Outside, faintly, through the open window above the garage, came the sound of the box fan cycling, and beneath it, almost too soft to separate from the machine noise, a woman's voice, low, tuneless, singing something that wasn't quite a song. The protagonist listened to it the way he'd once listened for an engine misfire, full attention, no visible strain. She know you still keep this? He asked. She knows? The former MP tapped the folder twice, like closing a casket lid gently. She asked me not to show her again. Said once was enough to understand what she'd been living next to. The protagonist nodded, though something in him kept circling back the way it always did, unable to fully set the night down. The sedan's headlights swinging wide and unhurried across an empty lot. The sound of a woman's voice stating an impossible fact about the world, the way you'd state a fact about weather. He was still turning it over when the garage door creaked, and a small voice called down the stairwell, sleepy, delighted, entirely unafraid. The small voice belonged to the daughter, 14 months old now, calling for something only she understood, and the protagonist let the sound pull him back the way a tide pulls at a man standing too long in the shallows. That August night, before the convoy, before the folder, before any of it had a name, he had knelt beside the open passenger door of her sedan, the dome light throwing a weak yellow circle over upholstery gone soft with wear, and reached beneath the seat for a pacifier that had rolled out of the infant's small fist. His fingers had found something else first. Scuffed metal, cool despite the heat trapped in the car all day. A crescent moon, no bigger than his thumb, its edges worn smooth by handling. A single tiny bell rattling loose somewhere inside its curve. He had gone still in a way that had nothing to do with tactical caution. The young mother, jostling her daughter against her shoulder, hadn't noticed yet. She was watching the lot, the tree line, the stretch of Route 9 where headlights sometimes swung too slow and too long. It's hers, she'd said without turning, meaning the rattle, assuming that was the question in his silence. Her grandmother's. Found it at a yard sale in Ohio, of all places. She says it's an antique. I think it's just old. He had not answered right away. He'd turned it over once in his palm, the way he might check a part for a stamp he already expected to find, and then he'd reached into his vest, into the inside pocket where his fingers knew the shape without needing his eyes, and drawn out its twin. Identical scuffing, identical bell, gone slightly flat with age. The same crescent, the same hairline scratch across the widest curve, as if both had been made in the same run, in the same year, by the same careless hand at the same factory somewhere that had probably closed decades ago. Where'd she get it? He'd said, and his voice had come out lower than he meant it to. I told you. Yard sale. She'd finally looked at him then, at the 2 rattles held side by side in the weak dome light, and something in her face had shifted from exhaustion into a different, more careful kind of attention, the look of someone reading a man's face for danger, and finding, instead, something she didn't have a word for. He had not explained. Not that night. He'd only closed his hand around both rattles at once, felt the 2 small bells click together once, faint and metallic, like a question being asked and answered in the same breath, and understood that he had already decided something the rest of him hadn't caught up to yet. Upstairs now, the small voice called again, closer, and the box fan kept turning, and the folder sat closed on the table between two men who had both learned, in their own ways, what it cost to look away. He had walked out to the truck after that, alone, telling the others he needed air, and the August heat had wrapped around him like something with hands. The lot lights buzzed overhead, moths knocking themselves stupid against the glass. He'd stood by the tailgate with both rattles in his fist and let himself go back, just for a minute, to a room he did not visit on purpose anymore. 14 years. A hospital corridor the color of old teeth. A nurse, who would not meet his eyes when she came out the second time. He remembered the weight of the blanket after, how it had felt lighter than it should have, how his wife's hand had found his in the waiting room chair, and how neither of them had said anything, because there was nothing built yet, in any language, for what they were carrying. He remembered buying the rattle 3 days before, from a bin at a drugstore outside Modesto, because it had caught the light funny, and made a small, stupid sound that made her laugh once, only once, in the last week she was ever going to laugh at anything. He had kept it in his vest pocket every day since, not for luck. He didn't believe in luck. He kept it because some griefs need a body, something you can close your hand around when the world gets too loud, and a rattle was small enough to carry, and hard enough to survive being carried. Now there was another one, its twin down to the same hairline scratch along the crescent's curve, wedged under a stranger's car seat like it had been waiting 14 years to be found by the one man who would know what it was. He did not believe that either. He believed in factories, in bad luck, in the ordinary cruelty of coincidence. But belief and decision are not the same animal, and somewhere between the drugstore bin and this gravel lot, the second one had already been made. He would not tell them why. Not tonight, maybe not ever in full. Grief like his did not translate well into words a crew could carry along with their own. But he understood, standing there with two small bells clicking faintly against each other in his palm, that he had crossed some line without a ceremony to mark it, the way a man crosses from watching a house burn to walking into it, without ever consciously choosing the second thing over the first. He put both rattles back in his pocket, side by side, and walked back toward the light of the kitchen window, where the folder still sat closed on the table, and the fan kept turning, and, upstairs, the small voice had gone quiet again, waiting, the way children wait, for someone to come and prove the night was safe. Now, 14 months later, the fan in that kitchen window was long gone, replaced by a window unit that hummed against the garage apartment's single-bedroom wall, and the folder that had sat closed on the table had long since become paper nobody needed anymore, filed away in a courthouse basement, where such things go to be forgotten by everyone, except the people they were written about. She found him on the stairwell on a Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary hour that the two of them had learned not to take for granted. Her daughter down for the night, the garage bay below empty of bikes, the whole building settling into the particular quiet of a place where nothing bad had happened in a long time. She sat 2 steps above him, the way she did most evenings now, not because she needed to, but because the habit of proximity to safety had never quite left her, and he understood that some habits are not meant to be broken, only softened. "You never told me," she said, "why your hands shook." He did not look up right away. He was working a scrap of leather between his fingers, an old habit from a man who had spent 40 years needing something to do with his hands besides shake. "That's a fair question. It's been over a year. I know how long it's been." She waited. She had learned, in the month since that August, that he answered on his own schedule, and that rushing him only closed the door faster. So she sat with her knees drawn up, watching the moth circle the bulb above the garage door, and let the silence do the work silence does. "I had a rattle like that once," he said finally. "Same shape, same sound." "I know. You told me that part. I didn't tell you the rest." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." The window unit clicked off, and in the sudden quiet the crickets took over, and somewhere down the road, a dog barked twice and gave up. He turned the leather scrap over once more, then put it in his pocket, the same pocket, she noticed, that had held 2 small crescent moons on a gravel lot outside Willow Creek. "Someday," he said, "I'll tell you the rest." "That's what you said last spring." "I meant it then, too." She almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere between amusement and old grief, because she had learned that some men carry their wounds the way she had once carried her daughter, pressed close, hidden under a coat, protected less from the world than from the asking. She did not push. She had been on the other side of that kind of silence, in a car on a dark highway, hoping no one would ask her to explain more than she could bear to say. She stood, brushed off her jeans, and touched his shoulder once on her way past, the same gesture she would realize only years later that a person makes when they have decided to trust someone with the unanswered part of a story. That gesture belonged to 14 months later. On the night itself, there had been no time for gestures. Only the fast arithmetic men do when they have spent decades learning to read a lot before it turns dangerous. He remembered it now the way he remembered weather, not as a sequence of facts but as a pressure in the chest, the rattle still warm from her palm. The sedan's headlights sweeping the fence line for the 3rd time in an hour, slow, deliberate, a man in no hurry because he believed he owned the road he was hunting on. 6 of them had stood in a loose half-circle by the pumps, not speaking, the way men who have ridden together long enough can hold a conversation in glances. The quiet one, the former MP, had already stepped back into the shadow of the ice machine, phone raised at an angle that looked like nothing more than a man checking a text. "We're not going over there," the president said, and it wasn't a question, and nobody treated it like one. One of the younger Patches, still new enough to want to prove something, shifted his weight toward the road. "He's circling her. That's a badge and a bad idea. That's exactly why we're not going over there." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The club's code was old enough that it didn't require footnotes. What we protect, we keep, and keeping was not the same as confronting. A confrontation gave a man like that a story to tell later, a version where he'd been threatened, provoked, forced to defend himself. A convoy gave him nothing, just 6 bikes and a sedan, moving through the dark like weather nobody could argue with. So they built the plan in under 2 minutes, in the clipped shorthand of men who had spent years deciding things quickly and living with the consequences. 2 riders would take point, setting pace so her car never had to accelerate hard or brake late. 2 would flank, close enough to fill his mirrors, far enough not to touch bumper to bumper. 1 would trail, watching the unmarked cruiser the way a man watches a storm cell on radar, close enough to track it, far enough to never be baited into a straight fight. The nurse's number was already dialed, already ringing in a farmhouse 2 counties over, a woman who had spent 30 years patching up men who couldn't afford questions at an ER. He walked back to the car. The baby had gone quiet against her mother's collarbone, one small fist curled loose now, the storm of crying passed like weather that moves on. He crouched by the open door, met her eyes, and for the first time all night his voice came out steady. "We're going to get you to somewhere safe. You don't slow down, you don't stop, no matter what you see behind you. Can you do that?" She nodded, and behind her, in his pocket, the second rattle sat still, cold, and impossibly heavy. The convoy pulled out of the rest stop in the order he'd set, headlights swinging wide across the gravel, before finding the black seam of Route 9 and settling into it like water finding a channel. No moon that night, or none you could see, just a lid of cloud pressed low over the valley, heavy with a heat that hadn't broken since noon, and the highway unspooling ahead in the narrow cone of each bike's beam, gone again, as soon as it passed beneath the tires. 14 years he'd ridden roads like this one. He had never once felt the dark sit on his shoulders the way it did now. Her car held the middle of the formation, a sedan with a spiderweb taillight and a bumper that had seen better decades, and above the engine noise he thought he could still hear, or imagined he could, the small sounds of a baby settling into sleep against her mother's collarbone. He didn't look back to check. He trusted the flanking riders to watch what he couldn't. It was the trailing rider, the quiet one, the one who'd spent 4 years as an MP before the discharge that nobody asked him about, who eased back a quarter mile, when the cruiser's headlights first bloomed in his mirrors, then farther still, until the distance between them was nothing but two sets of lights swimming in the black. He didn't speed up, he didn't slow down. He held the gap the way he'd once held a perimeter, out of habit worn smooth as a river stone, and when the road bent enough to give him an angle without exposing his own plate, he lifted his phone one-handed off the tank bag and began to shoot. Not video, stills. 3, 4, 6 of them, the cruiser's grille lit orange each time by his own taillight, the plate legible if you knew how to read a photograph taken at 60 miles an hour in the dark, which he did. He'd learned it in another country, in another decade, photographing convoys for reasons that had nothing to do with mothers or infants, and some skills, once burned into a man, never entirely leave him. He didn't feel triumphant doing it. He felt exactly the way he had back then, narrow, focused, the world reduced to a rectangle of glass and a target holding still long enough to be named. He radioed once, low static crackling through 6 earpieces. Got the plate, got the grill. He's hanging back 400 yards, matching our speed, not closing. A pause, then, flatter. He's not stupid. He's patient. Up front, the president heard it and said nothing, only adjusted his throttle a fraction, holding the pace steady, holding the whole fragile procession together on a road with no shoulder and no light and nothing ahead of them but more dark, mile after mile, until the farmhouse came. Now, 14 months later, the stairwell above the garage held a different kind of quiet. She had asked him the question 3 times before, always sideways, always when her hands were busy with something else. Folding a blanket, screwing a bottle cap tight, so that the asking could pretend to be incidental. This time she didn't look away. The toddler was heavy against her shoulder, one fist closed around the collar of her shirt, and the president stood at the bottom of the steps with his helmet under his arm, the way a man holds his hat at a graveside. "That rattle," she said. "The one you gave back to me that night, you looked at it like it bit you." He could have said nothing. He had said nothing to that question for 14 months, and silence had never once failed him. Silence was the only inheritance he trusted. But the child made a small sound against her mother's neck. Not a cry, just the sound of sleep arriving, and something in him loosened the way a rope loosens when the weight it's been holding finally settles. "It reminded me of someone," he said. That was all. 4 words, spent carefully, like currency he didn't have much of. He didn't say a name. He didn't say infant, or nursery, or 14 years, or the particular blue of a hospital blanket in October. He didn't say that the twin of that crescent moon had ridden in his vest pocket through more winters than he could count, worn smooth by his thumb, the way a rosary is worn smooth by grief that has nowhere else to go. He gave her the sentence and let it stand there, unfinished, the way a door left open 6 inches is still a door left open. She studied him. She had learned, in the year since Route 9, to read the things men didn't say. She'd had a decade of practice reading a man who used silence as a weapon, and she was still learning that silence could also be a kind of shelter. She didn't push. She shifted the child higher on her shoulder and looked down at him with something that wasn't pity, because he would not have accepted pity, but was close enough to it in shape that it made his jaw tighten. "Okay," she said, and left it there too. The screen door above her creaked once in the wind. Somewhere out past the fence line a dog was barking at nothing, the way dogs do at dusk, and the sky over the garage had gone the color of a bruise healing, not the raw purple of impact but the yellow-green of something mending. He turned the helmet over once in his hands, feeling the familiar weight of it, and thought, not for the first time, that some doors were only ever meant to open a few inches. That was enough. It had to be enough. He touched the flat of his vest pocket once, out of old habit, and turned back toward the bikes lined up in the last of the light. That night had its own kind of dusk, 3 hours deep by the time the convoy hit the stretch of Route 9, where the trees crowded close, and the shoulder disappeared into ditch grass. He remembered the temperature had not broken even at 11 o'clock, the asphalt still breathing heat up through his boots at the last stop, and how her hands had been steady on the wheel in a way that told him she'd done this kind of driving before. The kind where steadiness wasn't calm, but discipline laid over panic like a tarp over a fire. He was riding point off her left rear quarter panel, close enough to see the child seat's outline through the back window, when the headlights came up fast from a side road that had no business having traffic on it at that hour. The cruiser didn't have its bar lights on. It didn't need them. It cut across the intersection 30 yards ahead, unhurried, deliberate, the way a man moves when he wants you to know he isn't afraid of being seen. Brake lights flared red down the line. He felt his own bike shudder under him as he slowed, the whole convoy contracting like a hand closing. Her car dropped to a crawl behind the retired MP's taillight. He watched her knuckles through the glass, watched them go white on the wheel, watched her check the mirror once, twice, a third time, the way a person checks a stove they're sure they left on. He brought his bike up alongside her window without deciding to. There was nothing to say through glass at 45 miles an hour. He didn't try. He rode there instead, close enough that she could see him without turning her head, close enough that his shoulder became the only fixed point in a night that had started moving too fast around her. The cruiser held its position at the intersection for 11, 12 seconds. He counted them the way he'd once counted incoming rounds, a habit that never left a man, then eased forward onto the road behind them, no hurry in it, matching their pace like something that already knew where they were going. Nobody spoke over the comms. Nobody needed to. He kept his eyes forward and his bike steady in her blind spot's edge, close enough to matter, far enough not to crowd her mirrors, and he thought about how some kinds of protection weren't about doing anything at all. They were about being visible, about making sure that when she looked left, there was a shape there that wasn't going anywhere, wasn't flinching, wasn't the badge behind her. The cruiser's headlights held steady in his own mirror for the better part of a mile, patient as a held breath, and he understood, with the flat certainty of a man reading terrain, that this was only the first time tonight the road would try to close around her. The cruiser fell back at the county line, unhurried, the way a man steps back from a door he knows he can open again whenever he chooses. He watched it go in the mirror until the dark folded it away, and only then did his shoulders come down half an inch, the kind of easing that isn't relief, so much as the body deciding it can afford to breathe on a 5 count instead of a 2. She was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that he thought she might not speak again until the safe house. Then, over the comm line he'd rigged so her voice could reach him without her hands leaving the wheel, she said, "He knew which state to look in before I even crossed it." He didn't answer. He'd learned, over 3 decades of listening to people who were finally ready to talk, that the worst of it came out sideways, in pieces that didn't want to be forced. "There's a man he went through the academy with," she said, "runs plates for him off the record. I found out because he told me once, like it was funny, said, Ohio's got a guy, Kentucky's got a guy, everybody's got a guy, if you know how to ask nice." The road unspooled dark and flat ahead of them, the kind of stretch where a man could see trouble coming from 3 miles off and still not have time enough. He kept his eyes on it and let her keep talking, because he understood that this was the shape her courage took, not looking at anyone, aiming the words at the windshield instead. "I registered the car under my sister's name in Kentucky. Took me 2 weeks to save enough for new plates. I thought I was smart." A sound came out of her that wasn't a laugh. He had them by that Friday. 14 years dropped away from him in that half second, thin as paper. He thought of case files that never got opened, because the man behind the badge was also the man who'd have to open them. He thought of every small town he'd ridden through, where the uniform was the last word, not the first line of an argument. "That's not bad luck," he said finally. "That's a system." She didn't answer right away. In the mirror, her hand found the shape of the crescent moon rattle, where it sat now on the passenger seat beside the diaper bag, and her fingers curled around it the way his had curled around its twin for 14 years, without her seeming to know why. "I used to think if I just got far enough," she said, "there'd be a line he couldn't cross. A place with no badge to open the door for him." He watched the empty road, the borrowed dark, the exact place 2 states had already failed to be that line for her, and said nothing, because there wasn't yet an answer he was willing to make a promise out of. Now, above the garage, the retired nurse kept a landline nobody used anymore, except for exactly this kind of night, and 14 months later she still had not disconnected it, though her hands had gone softer since she'd traded a trauma unit for a garden and a scanner she pretended not to listen to. She remembered the call had come in at 11:40, or close to it. She had been standing at her sink, rinsing a single plate, because she had eaten alone that night, as she ate alone most nights, and the phone had rattled against the wall the way old phones do when they mean it. The voice on the other end had not identified itself first. It had said, "We need the house ready," and only after that, "It's a mother and a baby, maybe 7 months old," and only after that, almost as an afterthought, the thing that made her set the plate down without drying it. "There's a badge involved." She had not asked whose badge. In 31 years of nursing club wounds that never saw an ER intake form, she had learned that the fewer questions she asked on the front end, the more good she could do on the back end. She had turned on every light in the house that had a working bulb, because a lit house looks occupied and safe, and an occupied, safe-looking house was the only kind of message she knew how to send down a dark county road to a car she couldn't see yet. She had pulled 2 blankets from the cedar chest, the soft ones, because babies that age startled at rough fabric even in their sleep, and she had known that detail before she'd known the child's name, because she had held enough babies at enough 2 a.m.s to have stopped needing names to know what they needed. She remembered thinking, while she filled a bottle of water she had no way yet of knowing whether the mother would need, that this was the 3rd time in 6 years she had gotten a call like this, and each time the sentence had contained fewer facts and more silence, as if the men calling her had learned that silence traveled the phone line safer than detail did. She had not known, that night, about a crescent moon rattle, or a car that had crossed 2 states, or a man circling a rest stop with his engine running and his badge in his glove box like a second gun. She had known only what the machinery required her to know: a mother, a child, a threat with a title in front of it, and she had made the house ready before the phone ever rang a second time, before the convoy had covered a single mile of the dark between the rest stop and her porch light, because that was what 31 years had taught her a house was for. The second time, there was no warning at all. They had come off the county road onto a 2-lane stretch where the corn stood taller than a man on either side, walling the highway into something narrow and private, the kind of road built for nothing, passing at 3 in the morning, except deer and trouble. He had been riding the flank closest to her car, close enough to see the shape of her hands on the wheel through the rear window, when the headlights bloomed in his mirror. Not behind them, but beside them, already beside them, the cruiser having cut its own lights half a mile back and run dark until it was almost even with her door. The whitewash hit her window first. He saw it fill the car, saw the outline of the car seat go stark and colorless for a fraction of a second, saw her shoulders lift toward her ears the way a body braces before it decides whether to run or freeze. He did not radio the others. There was no time and no need. They had ridden together long enough that the shift in his position told them everything a voice could have. He eased the bike right, into the gap between the cruiser and her door. 6 inches, then 6 more, the wind off the corn shoving at him, the front tire wandering the white line like a live thing he had to keep talking down. He did not look at the man behind the cruiser's wheel. He did not speed up. He held the throttle steady, holding the lane the way a man holds a door shut against weather, and let the distance between the 2 vehicles close to nothing but himself. The cruiser held its speed. So did he. For 11 seconds he would count them later, lying awake, the way a man counts anything he cannot stop replaying. The 2 vehicles ran even, separated by a Harley and a stripe of asphalt, and nothing else happened. No horn, no siren, just the corn going by in a long gray blur, and the cruiser's headlights lighting the underside of his mirrors white. Then the cruiser fell back. Not far, not gone. 100 yards, maybe less. Close enough that its headlights stayed low in his mirror the rest of the way to the county line, patient in the way of something that had learned patience from a badge instead of a heart. He did not touch the throttle to celebrate it. He simply kept riding, kept his shoulder between the cruiser and her door, and did not let himself believe, not yet, that the night was done asking things of him. The county line came up as a green sign with a bullet hole through the O, and it was there, in that stretch where the shoulder widened and the corn gave way to a gravel turnout, that the cruiser closed the gap one final time. Not to pass, not to force anything, but to draw even again, close enough that he could see, in the wash of dashboard light, the shape of the man's mouth working behind the glass. It opened, closed, opened again, like a man rehearsing a sentence he could not commit to saying out loud. The protagonist did not look at him directly. He had learned that much from 30 years of eyes across a bar, across a courtroom, across a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, that a man deciding whether to become a worse version of himself does not want an audience, and giving him one is its own kind of mercy, cheap as it feels. So he watched the road instead, and the mouth kept working, and one gloved hand came up off the wheel and hovered near the door handle the way a diver's hand hovers near a ripcord, testing the idea of it, and then came back down. He never opened the door. Nobody would ever know, later, what exact thought pulled that hand back, whether it was 6 bikes and a stripe of taillights he could not out-argue, or some smaller calculation about badge numbers and witnesses and a wife's testimony, already halfway to being believed. The protagonist did not need to know. He only needed the door to stay shut, and it did. For another quarter mile, another half, the cruiser holding even with the last bike in line, like a man walking someone to a car he is not invited to enter. Then, without signal, without sound, it dropped back one more time, and at the exit ramp, a single reflective sign, a gas station sign burned dark since before either of them was born. It peeled away east, taillights shrinking into the corn until they were nothing, until the road ahead was just road again, black and empty and theirs. No one raised a fist. No one had to. The convoy held its line a full mile past the exit before he let himself believe it, and even then he did not slow the throttle, did not loosen his shoulders, because he had learned long ago that the moment you trust a quiet road is the moment it stops being quiet. He rode on into the flattening dark, the moon rattle a small cold weight against his ribs, and somewhere behind him, in a car with its headlights doing exactly as told, a woman was still holding her daughter's mouth shut against a cry that hadn't come in miles. The nurse's place announced itself before it appeared, a mailbox leaning sideways at the end of a gravel spur, a porch light left burning for a stranger who had not yet been born into their lives, and then the house itself, low and white and unremarkable in the way that safety is always unremarkable, never grand, never the thing you'd notice twice. Dawn had not yet broken, but had started clearing its throat, the sky over the tree line going the color of a healing bruise, gray shading toward something that might, eventually, be called morning. He walked her to the door himself. The others stayed with the bikes, engines ticking as they cooled, the sound of 6 machines settling into stillness like something exhaling after holding its breath too long. The nurse, gray-haired, unhurried, a woman who had clearly opened this door for strangers before, took one look at the girl's face and stepped back without a single question, the kind of silence that comes only from long practice. At the threshold, he stopped her. He took the rattle from his vest pocket. In the porch light it looked smaller than it had in the dark of the highway, more scuffed, more ordinary. A crescent moon worn thin at the curve where a thumb might rub it 1,000 times without thinking. He held it out, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if the object itself required some kind of permission to change hands. For her, he said, when she's old enough to hold things. The young mother looked at it, then at him, and did not ask why a man who rode with 5 others through a night like that would be carrying a baby's toy 14 years old, and colder than anything that had happened on the road behind them. Maybe she understood there are questions you don't ask a man whose face has already answered them. She took it. Her fingers closed around it the way her hand had closed around her daughter's mouth for 6 hours straight. Careful, complete, unwilling to let go until the threat had passed. Except the threat, for now, had passed. It should belong to someone still growing up, he said, and that was all he offered, and it was enough, because grief explained in full is grief performed, and he had never once performed his. The nurse's door closed soft behind them both. He stood on the gravel a moment longer than he needed to, listening to the house settle into its new weight, and then turned back toward the bikes, toward the 5 men waiting without asking, toward the long ride home that would not, he already knew, end the story so much as begin the part of it that would take months to finish. The phone rang while he was wiping down the chrome on the tank of the bike nearest the garage door, a rag gone black at the corners from years of the same grease, the same motion. He did not recognize the number, but he recognized the rhythm of it. 3 rings, then silence, then a callback, the pattern the quiet one had taught him to expect, from a man who did not trust lines he hadn't swept himself. He answered standing in the doorway, one boot on the concrete, one on the gravel apron outside, so that half of him was still in shadow, and half of him was already in the heat of the afternoon. "It's moving," the voice said. No greeting, it never gave one. Moving how? Patterns corroborated. GPS pings matched the cruiser logs on 3 of the 4 dates we flagged. 4th one, he used a personal vehicle, but the DMV pull ties back to his login, time-stamped an hour before the plate showed up outside that rest stop. He said nothing. Above him, through the ceiling, he could hear the small, patient sound of footsteps, hers, and behind them, smaller, uneven ones, testing the floor the way children test floors, like the ground might change its mind. "There's enough for a hearing," the voice went on. "Not a formality, a real one. Chief's already asking why a man under a permanent restraining order had database access at all. When? 6 weeks, maybe 8. He looked out at the yard, at the row of bikes catching the light, at the long flat road beyond the fence that led, eventually, to Route 9, though from here it looked like it led to nothing at all. "She know yet." "That's on you," the voice said. "I just move paper." The call ended the way it always did, without ceremony, and he stood a moment with the phone still against his ear, as if the silence after might still have something to add. It didn't. It rarely did. That was the thing about this kind of waiting. It did not announce its own weight, it simply accumulated, the way a debt accumulates, quietly, in rooms no one is watching. He put the rag down on the seat of the bike and did not pick it back up. 14 months had taught him that some news needed to travel up a flight of stairs slowly, the way you'd carry something full to the brim, careful not to spill the parts that mattered. He climbed them one at a time, boots loud on the wood, and above him the footsteps stopped, as if she'd already heard something in the sound of his walking that she recognized, the particular weight of a man arriving with news he hadn't yet decided how to soften. She was standing in the doorway when he reached the top, one hand braced on the frame, the other already reaching for the child's blanket, though the child was not crying, had not cried, was only sleeping in the next room, with the particular stillness of a house that had learned, slowly, to trust its own quiet. He didn't make her ask. "It's done," he said. "Permanent order. His badge is gone." She didn't move for a long moment. Her face did the thing faces do when relief arrives too late to be recognized as relief, a kind of blankness, as if the news had to pass through some older, more guarded room first, before it was allowed to mean anything. He remembered the courtroom the way he remembered the night itself, in pieces that didn't quite connect. The retired nurse in the pew behind her, spine straight, hands folded the way she must have once folded them over patients whose lives depended on her not flinching. The internal affairs contact reading from pages that had once been nothing but a man's voice on the phone in the dark. GPS pings laid end to end like a trail of small confessions. DMV records pulled without cause, a pattern the department could no longer call coincidence. The husband's face across the room, not cruel in that moment, only diminished. A man watching the only leverage he'd ever had, a badge, a database, a patrol contact's favor, dissolve into something he could no longer use against anyone. The judge's voice had been unhurried, almost bored, the way justice sometimes sounds when it finally arrives on schedule instead of by miracle. Restraining order made permanent. Employment terminated pending review. It had taken 4 minutes to undo what had taken 2 states and 160 miles to survive. Outside on the courthouse steps, she had exhaled once, long and low, the kind of breath that empties a person out before it lets them fill back up. The nurse had stood beside her without speaking, one hand resting lightly between her shoulder blades, the two of them looking out at a parking lot full of ordinary cars in ordinary sunlight, as if daring the world to be dangerous again, and finding, for once, that it declined. He hadn't told her, back then, what he'd felt watching that exhale from the far end of the steps. that it was the sound he'd been listening for since a hospital corridor 14 years before he'd ever laid eyes on her, the sound of a held breath finally allowed to end. Now, in the doorway, she nodded once, slow, and looked past him down the stairwell as though checking that the stairs themselves hadn't changed. "Okay," she said. "Just that." Behind her, the child stirred, made a small sound, and did not cry. The months that followed did not announce themselves. They simply accumulated the way rust does, or trust, slow, unremarkable, easy to miss if you weren't the one keeping count. September, she carried boxes up the garage stairs herself, refusing help twice before accepting it the third time, and he understood that the refusing mattered as much as the accepting. October, the child took her first steps across the plywood floor above the bay where he kept his bike, arms out, unafraid of falling because falling, in that room, had never once cost her anything. He stood in the doorway that evening, with a torque wrench still in his hand, and did not go in, only watched, the way a man watches weather clear from a safe distance. The nurse visited on Sundays for a while, then every other Sunday, then simply when she felt like it, which he understood was its own kind of graduation, the slow retirement of vigilance into something closer to friendship. He kept track, without meaning to, of the nights. He knew, the way you know the sound of your own truck engine, which nights the child slept clean through until morning, and which nights she didn't. By November, there were more of the first kind than the second. By December there was a stretch. 11 nights, he counted them on the shop calendar, without writing anything down, just a private tally kept behind his sternum, where she did not wake once, did not cry out, did not need the cupped hand or the low humming voice that had once been the only wall between her and the world. He did not tell the mother he was counting. Some things you carry the way you carry a rosary, worn from private use, not meant for display. What surprised him was not the child's healing. Children, he'd read once, in some pamphlet from the VA he never finished, were built for it in ways adults weren't. What surprised him was his own. He found himself, some evenings, sitting on the garage stairwell after the lights upstairs had gone soft and blue with television light, and instead of the old ache arriving alone, sharp, singular, it arrived beside something else now. The sound of small feet overhead, a woman's voice low and unhurried, a life continuing in the room above the room where he kept his tools. He did not stop grieving. He simply stopped grieving by himself. The rattle stayed in his vest pocket. He touched it less now, not because he'd forgotten, but because he no longer needed reminding. 14 months out from that August night, he still hadn't told her the whole of it, what the sound of her exhale on the courthouse steps had cost him to hear, and what it had given back. The last Tuesday in October, he came up the stairwell to bring a bag of oranges someone had left at the clubhouse, more than one family could eat, and he found her on the top step with the girl heavy and half asleep against her chest. She had one hand cupped over the child's mouth. He stopped where he was, the oranges cold through the paper bag, because for a fraction of a second his body remembered before his mind did. The rest stop, the diesel smell, the way she had done exactly this 14 months ago, with her spine pressed to the car door and her eyes fixed on the far side of the lot, where a cruiser idled with its lights off. But the girl wasn't crying now, she was humming. The hand over the small mouth was not muffling anything. It was keeping time, the way a mother's hand will find a rhythm without deciding to, tapping the child's lower lip in 3-count intervals while she rocked, and the sound coming out from under her palm wasn't a whimper choked down, but a tune half-formed, the kind babies make when they're already most of the way to sleep and don't need silence, only softness. He set the oranges down on the step below him. She looked up, not startled, she rarely was, anymore, and that itself was a thing he'd learned to notice, the absence of flinch where flinch used to live automatically, and she said, "She does this now instead of crying. Hums when she's tired." "Good sound," he said. "It is." He didn't tell her what he'd seen in the gesture, the old one laid over the new one like tracing paper, danger becoming lullaby. He didn't tell her that, for 14 months, he'd been quietly matching her exhales to some private ledger of relief, or that the rattle in his vest pocket had gone from something he touched to something he simply knew was there, the way a man knows his own pulse without checking for it. What he understood, sitting on the step below her with the oranges between them, was that the thing he'd pulled her out of that August night had never really been one man in an unmarked car. It was the flat, practiced certainty she'd carried into that rest stop, that badges outweighed truth, that 6 strangers on motorcycles were a stranger's problem and not a stranger's answer, that no one with any real power would ever choose to stand on her side of a line. He hadn't argued her out of that belief. He'd simply stood there long enough and kept standing until it stopped being true. Above them, the girl's humming trailed into breath, even and slow. He picked the oranges back up, climbed the last 2 steps, and set the bag down inside the door without another word, because some things, once fixed, don't need saying twice.